I was teaching for the hospices in the Bay Area some years ago. And at one of the meal breaks, I sat at the table, and next to me, I met a hospice worker named Salam Khalili, who ended up becoming one of my closest friends in my life, who was a Palestinian man that time in his early 50s. And I turned to him and we introduced each other, and I said, "What brings you to hospice work?" I hadn't met many Palestinian immigrants on the hospice circuit. And he said, "Well, it seems important to be able to sit with people and let them know that dying is perfectly safe." And I said, "Oh?" And he said, I asked him, I said, how did you learn that? Where does that come from? So he said, "Let me tell you a story." I'm good already, tell me a story. He said he had been a journalist in Jerusalem back in the 1960s, and he was writing about a free Palestinian state just around the time of the 1967 war, when it became illegal to write in that way. And so he was periodically rounded up and thrown in jail, and then he would write more about Palestinian freedom and be thrown in jail again. And over the course of that time, he spent about 7 years in Israeli prisons and jails. And he said some of the guards were fine and some were not. He said, I had this Russian guard who'd been a successful engineer in Russia and then immigrated to Israel and couldn't get an engineering job, and all he could get was the night guard job in a prison. And he was bitter. And being bitter, he also was mean. And I was in my cell one night, and he said something or whatever, and I just tried to answer him, and he didn't like my answer, and he hauled me out of the cell, and he began to hit me and beat me. And the next thing I know, I died. He said my body was on the floor, he was beating me, and then he was kicking me with this steel-toed boot, and blood was coming out of my mouth, and I later read the police report, and they thought I had died. But actually, he said, I floated out of my body, as happens in accidents and near-death experiences, and when you die too, you'll see, but we'll leave that for the moment. And I was there, kind of on the ceiling, witnessing all this very peacefully, the body and the boot and all of that. He paused and turned to me and said, and then something interesting happened. And I said, "Oh?" And he said, yes. Then it was as if at some moment the bubble of my sense of self popped completely, and I wasn't located on the ceiling anymore. That sense of identity dissolved, and I became everything. He said, and I was the green paint flecking on the walls of the prison cell, and I was the bars that you could see there, and I was the goat you could hear bleating outside on the hillside, and I was the body there in the bottom of the room, but I was also the boot kicking it, and I was everything. And he said, and then this immense joy filled me, because realizing I was everything, I also knew I could never die, that I was life itself. He said, and there was just this luminosity and joy. And then the next thing I knew, he said, I woke up a couple or a few days later in this battered body at the bottom of a cell. And it took a long time to heal. And it's important to understand that it's not what the Israelis are doing to the Palestinians, although they are, but this is war, and it happens on all sides. It's not just one-sided, this story. And gradually I healed. He said, and when I got out the next time, I couldn't work for the Palestinians anymore. It made absolutely no sense to struggle for Palestinian freedom. He said that the closest I could come is, I married a Jewish woman and we have Israeli Palestinian children. That's the closest I could come to what I understood. And he became a peacemaker. He was an artist and a visionary in many, many ways. But then he said, yeah, I go to hospice and sit with people who are dying and kind of remind them it's okay. And don't worry about it. It's perfectly safe.